Welcome back around this table for the Paramat Days. We have different speakers. The matter at hand now is whether transport risk was a major risk for companies. This is the issue that Mr. Oliver Wilde, chairman of EMRE, are going to discuss with Gilles Beneblanc, CEO of Verlingue. Hello, gentlemen. Over to you. Hello. Well, yes, today the idea was to talk about transport risk with Gilles. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm the chairman of EMRE, and one of the main avenues for us is the bedrock of risk management to identify risk before we need to use insurance-based solutions. So we're going to discuss that in the context of our discussion. I'm Gilles Beneblanc. I'm CEO of Verlingue and Adelaide. Oliver, let's organize our discussion as a chat, as we usually have together. To begin with, I wanted to have your opinion as a risk manager on transport risk or transport-related risks. Is there a distinction? What makes the most sense for you in analyzing this matter? I think there's both matters. You need to put the risk in context compared to all the risk analysis that you can conduct. As I was saying, any risk discussion needs to start with a good risk identification, because when risk is managed, the company is lasting, more responsible and more resilient. And it's hard for me to imagine to have a discussion on transport risk without talking about supply and logistical chain. We could see that with the COVID crisis. There were so many tensions in this area. So you need to have a good understanding of your risk and see what are the ways to control it, what alternatives you can have to that risk. And then based on your own business, whether you're a shipper or you're using shippers to transport your products, the risks are not going to be the same, and the dependencies are not the same either. On this matter of risk mapping, did transport risk figure highly on the risk map of companies that are not involved in shipping? And the positioning of transport risk in the mapping, have you seen it change with recent events, in particular COVID and the major events that happened? Well, unlike COVID, I think that transport risk is clearly on the risk map of companies. Of course, the impact and consequences will vary depending on the area of business or the importance of supply chain and logistics for the business. But with the COVID crisis, this risk got even bigger. You could see the difficulties that we were faced with, and it will still figure very high on the map, because there are all the consequences of the health situation. There's not just the health situation, but the economic and political implications, potentially social implications of the crisis. So you'll need to take that on board. Amongst the questions that we asked ourselves during the crisis about the management of logistics and supply, but also in the supply strategy discussions as well. There was a lot of talk about globalization and return to local, rather. So I think that we need to have a strategy that combines local and global, and to have these alternatives in mind when you want to manage this risk. Well, yes, you're right in saying that this COVID-19 crisis was multifaceted. There was a health crisis with the pandemic that we hope every other day that we'll get out of. There's the economic crisis with a 9% decline of GDP in France, something we hadn't had in decades. And of course, the financial crisis, which has been averted in the short term because of this big return and big use of central banks that funded debt through currency. And you talked about the societal crisis ahead, in that a big amount of the people who were affected by the COVID crisis were people who were already vulnerable, so we're never safe from that. Regarding transport quite clearly there were losses of revenues, supply difficulties. How have companies experienced the purely shipping aspects in the crisis? It was complicated, well, depending on your area of business, of course. But those companies that had identified supply and transport risks correctly put systems in place so that they could be more resilient against this current health crisis, but any other crisis. That could be a large-scale cyber attack that would immobilize logistical chains. You'll need to find alternatives. And I think that risk management now has a major place so that we can have a smart dialogue with insurers to show how we can manage risk and only use insurers for the exceptional part and for the support that we might need to manage these alternatives. What is interesting is that in the face of shortages, we needed to use logistic chains that we didn't used to rely on. And a lot of companies are also adapting their supply strategies. You can see that IKEA no longer wants to have just-in-time and have inventories, whereas they didn't have inventories in the past. This idea about stock management and flow management is going to have impacts on the business of shipping and logistics. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned cyber. There was this attack on a pipeline in the US, which was also, in a way, a supply problem for a competing source for tankers. Yes, quite. And another event that was really strong in the media, we all remember the picture of the Ever Given wedged into the bank of the Suez Canal. And so with this event, which didn't end too badly, not so bad after all, you could see that international supply was very fragile, and the way we've been working with these huge containers is very complicated, or container ships. What's interesting with this event is that there was a big media boom around this event. There was a sort of panic as well. There was the health crisis, then the Suez Canal blocked by a huge container ship, and you can see the cascading effects. Well, you can see the Suez Canal blocked and the whole chain of cascading consequences with all the ships that were stopped. You could see the pictures on TV. But what is interesting is that, after all, it was a fairly short-lived event. I'm always drawing a parallel with COVID, I'm sorry for that, but at the beginning people said that it was just like a seasonal flu. We've been in it for 18 months and it seems to be going on. If we hadn't been able to remove the Ever Given in just a few days, if it had lasted a month, what would have happened? What would have happened if it had lasted 3 months? Then the consequences would be dire. In just 6 days, there was phenomenal impact on price of oil and so on. You could see shortages of parts and supply delays and cost implications on materials as well. That's quite impressive. So, of course, to be resilient, we'll need to be able to stand on 2 legs or several legs to manage these types of risks. Well, you're right to talk about giants. My friend Mathieu Berrier gave me figures. Usually we've got 20,000 containers belonging to several loaders insured, and we are able to have container ships with 25,000 containers. There are 10,000 passengers on a cruise ship. The cruise ship industry has almost ground to a halt after double-digit growth for years. You can see the huge amounts of financial losses with insurance systems that are a bit timid about how to cover this giganticism. As maritime professionals, and me amongst them, we're talking about huge amounts of money, but it's no bigger than an oil rig or a big waste incineration station. Do you think that transport insurers or the transport insurance market should make progress on that? Well, processes and systems that are used might be changed in order to monitor risk, especially cumulative amounts. If you've got a container ship with over 20,000 containers, everyone holding just one bit, how can the insurer assess all that? There needs to be a dialogue. I'm a big proponent of dialogue with insurers. Good understanding of risk management and understand where everybody's responsibility ends and how you can manage it. Because when you subscribe a policy, everything is good, although things are a bit tense at the moment, but it's when there's a claim that the cookie crumbles. And if there's no crystal clarity about the responsibilities and cumulative values, then it gets very complicated to manage, as it was the case for the Ever Given. But large-scale or systemic risks that involve several actors or insured parties, there are many earthquakes, cyber risks, and I think it's not right that the insurance market is stepping out of that. We need to have a dialogue with the brokers, insured parties, and the insurance market to find the best solution. I think that in a transport market, there are going to be modeling effects and return on experience on claims and modeling on tracking and values. It's complicated because values changed. You saw that with the fire that happened in this Chinese harbor where everybody ended up with big cumulative values, but it's not inevitable. We need to become more technical. And in terms of tracking systems, there are things that are not yet available on all markets. But if you take the example of blockchain, people are thinking about the traceability of hazardous waste or the traceability of some materials. Maybe you could have a system that gives many faceted certifications so that it could have a comprehensive overview of the risk that is carried. And the last theme that I wanted to discuss with you is a major one. It's one that you care strongly about, the CSR approach and the environment. I mean, Veolia is a central player in these efforts. What's your view on the place, the contribution, and the efforts of the shipping sector in this area? Well, it's all major. You can see events on oil tankers and the direct environmental impact with the Erika shipwreck that polluted and so on. But there's also a lot of technology in vehicles. The vehicle that transports things, how does that work? Here we're talking about hydrogen and so on. So there's still some room for improvement. There are innovative solutions with the high-tech content, but all actors need to contribute to this development. Here we're seeing a situation where you've got actors, especially on the insurance market or investors, that are saying, I'm no longer going to work with this or that player because they have polluting activities, although they're trying to decarbonize, or it's a small part of their portfolio and they're investing in decarbonizing their business. So getting them out of their portfolio is not going to help them accelerate the transformation, but I think that insurers, brokers, all stakeholders should help them in this ecological transition. It's not by giving up on them that they'll go faster. It's only with support that they can bring the necessary changes, because the climate emergency didn't disappear with the COVID crisis. The challenge is still so big. And one of the things that illustrates what you said is public passenger transport, which is seen as a difficult risk by insurers. Of course, it's seen as consuming carbon, but it pollutes infinitely less than using individual cars. So it's a sort of paradox where it's probably not enough of a sector that at the end of the day is a good thing for the environment. Well, the ecological transformation needs to be supported. You shouldn't put things aside. You should help them. At Veolia in particular, we're not taking all coal-based activities out of our portfolio. We're turning them into green activities to follow this transition as an expert. That's part of the way. If you leave them by the wayside, they'll continue polluting and they won't start this transformation. We've almost reached the end of this chat, but to you, is there a message about this CSR matter for the insurance world, insurers, risk people? Do you think we've got a stronger risk to play than what we did in the past? Well, I think that this transformation in this CSR business must be part of our thinking. It shouldn't be something separate. It should be part of everything that everyone does. Because insurance is part of society as a whole, but we should strike the right balance. You can't shift everything overnight. You need to have an evolution in this transformation whilst taking into account and our thinking the environment as a stakeholder, society as a stakeholder, our employees, our workforce, and shareholders. And if you have a good balance for all of our many facets of performance, if you have a balance in meeting all the expectations from stakeholders, you'll get there. Of course, there will be trade-offs and decisions to be made. But if you're fully aware of expectations, then you can bring about a sustainable transformation that is going to be resilient to upcoming stresses and shocks. Well, resilience will come from compliance, but also probably from a risk culture improvement. Well, Oliver, I think we're on time. Thank you. Over to you for the conclusion. Well, yes, thank you, gentlemen, for this discussion that helped us address other topics. It was very interesting, and we'll carry on with the environmental issue with the next two panel discussions on maritime shipping lanes and airlines.